Cunningham, and I'm a Year 6 teacher here at St Peter's. I was in Year 5 for a few years before that. So I am the lead teacher for humanities, which covers history and geography. And I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about our history curriculum, how we do it, and what's happened in terms of the changes that our curriculum has gone through. So when I joined St Peter's about 4 years ago, our curriculum was entirely different to what it is now. And actually, I would say that for history, everything was kind of scattered and different depending on which year group you were in, and there wasn't much consistency. So we've gone through a process of reconstructing our curriculum, and at the core of everything that we've done is our pedagogy. So our school pedagogy of excellence as standard. As you can see, we have got the purpose, mastery, experts, models and clarity, and critique. And throughout the process of our history curriculum, this has been at the centre of everything that we do. I have hopefully enabled the teachers to feel like they are experts when teaching it, but actually we also want the children to feel like experts as they go through the school. We've used models to base our curriculum on. We've listened to critique when we've done pupil voice from children, but also from teachers at staff meetings. And the purpose of our curriculum is really at the core of everything we do. We want everything to have purpose. So I'm just going to go through the slides and show you the rationale for history. And before I talk, I'm just going to give you a minute or so to read that. I'm not going to read it for you because I know that that's a little bit frustrating when you're listening and reading at the same time. So our rationale for history came from the national curriculum. And there are a few things that I wanted to mention to you. So the first is that we really want the pupils to have curiosity. And we want children to be excited about what they're learning. We want them to have questions and things that they want to find out. And actually, we also want them to understand how things have come about in history. So I want them to ask questions, to think critically about sources and whether they're reliable enough, to think about the evidence for and against certain concepts. And actually, it's all about understanding people's lives and the complexity of that. And then in relation to that, things change. And that's the great thing about history, is that things are constantly changing. And actually, in our Year 5 curriculum, we include about the Bristol slave trade and Edward Colston. And we suddenly realised this year that we will need to change our curriculum to talk about the events in Bristol of recent years, and actually the fact that it's continually changing. And actually, history helps children to understand their own identity, where they've come from, and kind of the things that shape them. And one of the things that we wanted to do with our history curriculum is to really make sure that we include local history, so that children can learn about things that are closer to home and things that have happened recently and further in the past in terms of local history as well. So we want children at St Peter's to be historians, and actually these are the things that we want children to leave Year 6 knowing and doing. But actually at any age at St Peter's, we want children to be historians and to be able to understand the history of Britain and farther apart places as well. So we want them to know about the wider world. We want them to understand historical concepts. And we also want them to understand how historians work, the methods that they use for their inquiries, and how claims are made. And actually, the last point on this slide is really important. We want children to be able to place their knowledge into different contexts. And we want children to be able to understand the chronology of history and how things impact other events and other times. So on the screen now, I've just put our history curriculum map, and it includes from Year 1 up to Year 6, the history units that they will be learning. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to have a look at that now. One of the things that we really wanted to do when we looked at our curriculum is ensure that there was chronology, because that's an area of history that we really want children to be experts in. And when I first joined St Peter's, we were doing prehistory in Year 5. They would do the Egyptians in Year 3. year 6 would do World War II, and we were doing all of these units, but not really in a very well sequenced order. And actually, we wanted to make sure that children have a really clear understanding of where things fit into a timeline. So in Key Stage 1, the children are learning about significant people and events, particularly inventors. And then in Key Stage 2 from year 3, that's when we start focusing on the chronology of key points in history. And we've made some timelines. So this is the Key Stage 1 timeline. And as you can see, the events are actually quite close together. So between 1666 and 1871. So children will have a really good understanding of sort of timelines of people that maybe overlap with each other. And the year 2 teachers were actually talking to me the other day about how Florence Nightingale and things that she was doing were at the same time as Brunel. And the Wright brothers were then born a little bit later and their times overlap as well. So I think that gives children a really good understanding of some of these times and some of the things that happen there. And then when they join, sorry, before I carry on, I'm just going to show you these pictures. These were sent to me by the year 1 teachers. This was the first unit of work in the Great Fire of London. This was the very first lesson. And the children actually weren't told what the learning was about, but they were given some artifacts, some pictures, and they were asked to think like historians. And I think that really shows actually that we want children to be historians even from year 1. We want them to be using their clues and their knowledge and to be asking questions. And the children really enjoyed being given all of these artifacts and having to be detectives and work out what was happening. So when children get to year 3, we start teaching them the Stone Age and prehistory, and it goes through history chronologically all the way up to year 6 when we learn about Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement. And actually on the timeline here, we've also included where Christ was born, so that this is making some cross-curricular links so that children can think, oh, okay, the Romans, that was just after Christ was born. Oh, okay, that helps me to understand the historical and the RE learning that we're doing. And we are aware that children find it really hard to place things in history chronologically. And if somebody was to say to them, you know, which comes first, the ancient Egyptians or the Anglo-Saxons, there's a huge period of time between those events, but children may not feel confident being able to talk about it in order and to place them in context. So what we wanted to do is to enable children to think, oh, I learned that in year 3, so it must come before what I learned in year 4. And then what I learned in year 4 builds onto year 5, and that builds onto year 6. And it really means that we've got that consistency, and children can learn through time and learn as they get older how things have impacted other events. And one way that we would really like you at home to be embedding this is talking to your children about what they've learned in history and asking them, oh, okay, what did you learn last year? What are you learning now? What order did they come in? And really helping them to embed the fact that the things they learned when they were younger will then lead to things that happen later, which is great. We have redesigned our curriculum, as I said, and one of the things that I'm most proud of is that we've spent a lot of time designing some booklets. So from year 3 up to year 6, there's a booklet which we've created, and it contains all of the information that they need to know for that unit of work. And the children really enjoy looking at these. They're really beautifully created. There's lots of pictures inside, lots of information, and the children really enjoy looking through it. And actually, I think it's really nice to have that consistency in every year group from year 3 to year 6, that when we do history, we have a booklet that we can use. In terms of cross-curricular links as well, it helps them to build on their reading skills. They can retrieve information by looking back at it later. The booklets are available for them to revisit. If they can't remember something, they can have another look at it in a later lesson. In years 1 and 2, they still have information presented in a similar way, but at that point it's more interactive rather than booklets. One of the key parts of our history lessons is making sure that children have the vocabulary to be able to express themselves and to be able to explain historical concepts. We know we are a research-based school, and we know that research shows that children who have a vocabulary gap, so children with less vocabulary, also often have an attainment gap. So their understanding of concepts is often lower if they have gaps in their vocabulary, and that will really hinder them in later life as they're already starting at a disadvantage. So what we do all the way from year 1 all the way through to year 6 is whenever we start a history lesson, we introduce the children to the very important words that they're going to come across. The top slide is an example of this in a year one lesson. So they'll include a picture, they'll have some discussion about what those words mean. And in year 6, for example, with the World War II unit at the bottom, we give them a definition. Something that we do as a Mrs. Wordsmith school, I'm sure you've heard your children talking very excitedly about Mrs. Wordsmith, is we often come up with actions to relate to words, which really helps children to remember the word because of the action. So, for example, this is a geography unit, but in geography, the children were learning about the quality of life, and they were finding that really hard to remember when you sort of think about what does that mean, quality of life. And then they were also having to think about the standard of living, and they were really finding that hard to get their minds around the difference between those things. And by making up actions, it really enables children to understand that concept and to retrieve it in future weeks by reminding themselves of the actions. The very important word symbol is also something that we use in our reading in the moment and when we're doing reading in any context. So we often talk to the children about reading in history and reading in RE, and that actually we still need to use our reading skills in every single lesson that we come across. We are reading as historians. At the beginning of every lesson, we have a retrieval practice where children have an opportunity to test themselves and to retrieve information from what they've done earlier in the unit or in the year or even in previous years. And each unit of history starts with reminding themselves about the timeline and placing this new unit into context. Again, this is trying to help children to understand the chronology. In previous years, our retrieval practice has been very much focused on small details and remembering the very small facts within a unit. And actually, we've made the decision now that we really want children to understand the bigger picture. We want them to be able to put the bigger concepts of each unit into their long-term memory so that they're able to retrieve this and make links within units. So an example of this is in year 6, we've recently been learning about World War II. And to begin last lesson, I gave children 5 minutes to test themselves on the knowledge of the timeline. And I gave them some ideas of what they could do. So they could self-test, they could look at it, cover it up, say a bit and check it. They could have the timeline in front of them and fill in some blanks. They could try and recreate the timeline by drawing it. And I encouraged them to focus on one area at a time. So actually I was saying to the year 6 children that they could start with what they learned in year 5 and just remind themselves of the chronology of year 5 and year 6. And then they could go back to year 4 and then back to year 3 and build on it that way. It was really successful. And in my class, one child, within 5 minutes of just doing this to himself, was able to tell me the order of the events all the way from the Stone Age to the Civil Rights Movement. We have talked about the fact that it's probably in his short-term memory, but by revisiting that every week, he will have an opportunity to really embed that within his longer-term memory to try and remember that in future. We've also talked about recently coming up with key concepts, and this is quite a new thing at St. Peter's that we're just beginning to think about now. And when we were thinking about how the history units add to each other and lead to each other, we were thinking about the key things that we really want children to know. And actually, in any unit of history, we really want them to know the chronology. We want them to know where it comes in the timeline, what's happened before, what happens next, how it impacts on the things coming before it and after it. We want them to know the cause. Now, in an event like a war, we want them to know what caused that war to happen. But if it's an event like, for example, in year 4, they do about Roman Britain, we want the children to understand what caused Roman Britain to come about. So what caused that change to happen. We want children to know about significant people and the really key people that unit of history is centered around. And also the key events, the really important things, maybe 3 or 4 events that we want them to remember. In every unit of history, there is conflict. In a war-based unit, it's really easy to name what that conflict is. But actually, in any unit, there will be people that disagree with the historians or conflicting views or people that don't agree with what was happening at the time. So it's just about leading children to think about that. And then finally, the consequence. So what happened as a result of that unit of history? What happened next? What change did that make to the world? And this is something that we really want to embed within children so that whenever they think about a unit of history, even if they're in year 6, they can think back to their year 3 learning and think about what they learned then and how it's caused other things to happen and the significant people. In years 1 and 2, we've spent some time thinking about this. And actually, some of the key concepts are harder to consider when you're talking about a person, or, for example, Brunel in year 2. It's hard to think about the conflict within Brunel as a unit, but actually it's enabling children to understand the people that would have disagreed with what he was doing. So the people who, for example, were really scared by steam trains and they didn't want the steam trains to be built because they were so dangerous. Um, and although we understand that maybe an area of learning like um, prehistory, prehistory may have less significant people, but there are still significant eras in terms of humanity, like Neanderthals and Neolithic people. So we can still point out the groups of people that would have existed in those times. So this is something new that we're going to continue to embed within our history curriculum going forward. That's everything that I've got on my slides. I'm aware it's very much a whistle-stop tour and I've kind of given you a lot of information in one go. So I'd be really interested to know if you've got any questions. Before we do the questions, I will stop recording. Mr. Eustace, before I stop recording, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Miss Cunningham.
Thank you. So I'll stop recording now.